Okay, I'm sure we'll have a couple more people, but I'll use this time to get into it so that we don't waste any time for questions at the end. So before we get going, ARENA would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country across Australia and their continuing connection to land, sea, and community. And we also pay our respects to elders past and present. So on the agenda today, we're going to spend a couple of minutes just recapping what ARENA's mission is and role in the market. We'll then spend some time getting into the actual grit of what are the objectives of the industrial transformation stream that we're talking about today. A few moments on examples of actual projects that have been announced and funded. And then probably most meaningful to this audience, we'll get into how does ARENA actually consider merit and consider what projects might be funded, what the process looks like, how you actually start a conversation with ARENA, and then what kind of timelines are we talking about. So hopefully that all sounds compelling. I would appeal to you all to hang on to the end, because then we'll also do a very quick Slido survey where we'll pop the results up live so you can see how many of this audience is looking to get a hold of funding under this live round 2, which might be interesting. And we'll also have a chance to spend some quality time on questions that you might have. So many of you might be familiar with ARENA, but it's probably worthwhile explaining where it is in the market that we play. So ARENA's mission is to support the transition to net zero emissions by accelerating the pace of pre-commercial innovation. So if you think about kind of true lab bench style R&D, it's on the left-hand side of ARENA from a maturity perspective. Then you have ARENA's sweet spot, which is really progressing pilots, trials, demonstration, deployment. That might be small scale or it might be large scale. And from a dollar perspective, it could be anything from a $1 million pilot or engineering study all the way up to a large scale 60, 70, $80 million sizable deployment. And then on the right-hand side of ARENA, in terms of maturity, you start to get into the land of debt, equity funding, etc., where you have a bankable solution or product. You can feasibly show commercial returns, and that's where ARENA's funding no longer applies. So ARENA is meant to be last resort funding, and it's in the form of grants and it's paid in arrears. So just to give you a bit of a flavor of the quantum of funds that ARENA's invested in, to date, we're sitting at about $2.9 billion over 760 projects. That project value is nearly double that, or is more than double that amount by a decent way, with a leverage of 1 to 3.5 for every dollar of grant funding that's invested. It's Australia-wide, so we don't have the necessary geographic preference. And there's also multiple different technologies that are within our funding spectrum. So we don't have an investment thesis by specific technology areas, but we do have investment priorities which look at different portfolio areas. So I'm going to pass over to my colleague Pete, who's going to talk about the objectives of the program and of this active round to give you an idea of what we're actually looking for.
Thanks, Tanya. So I'd like to just quickly go through what this program and this round is all about. And this slide just provides a little bit of context and framing for where the industrial transformation stream fits against some of the other programs that are out in the market. So this is all part of the Powering the Regions Fund, and the particular stream we're talking about here is the Industrial Transformation Stream, or ITS for short, which ARENA administers and runs. So that's in the green on the left-hand side. There are 2 other streams indicated in grey to the right. These are not administered by ARENA. They're handled by the Department of Climate Change under the Grants Hub system. So there's kind of sister programs, if you like, but not handled through ARENA. But in terms of the ITS, this is a program that is targeting existing regional facilities that are reporting entities. So that's the sort of cohort of entities that the program targets. It covers both Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and as Tanya was saying a moment ago, is technology agnostic. We're not seeking to promote any one particular technology, but to identify opportunities to reduce both Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So some of the sorts of examples that we might be projects that might be appropriate under this program include energy efficiency, electrification, renewable projects, targeting things like process heat and thermal energy storage in particular. Some of you might be aware that the ITS was launched with a $400 million funding envelope. About 150 million of that is currently under assessment, working its way through the pipeline already from round 1, which closed a short while ago. So what we're now talking about is round 2 under that program. And just for context, again, you can see the other 2 programs in the grey there, again, not administered by ARENA, but the Safeguard transformation stream, which exists specifically for safeguard facilities, has a $600 million envelope, and about 225 of that has been allocated. And then there's a critical inputs into clean energy strategies, which has about 200 million allocated to it, which is pretty much all exhausted as we understand. Next slide, thanks, Tanya. So the objectives of the ITS are, as I said, to support industrial facilities in regional Australia. And the definition of regional Australia is a little bit arcane, I guess, but it's according to a definition that the ABS uses, which is an area that lies outside the greater capital cities areas. So we can provide a link to how to identify that. But that's where it's looking for, the area that it's looking for. And so we're looking to help those facilities reduce emissions in line with Australia's 2030 and 2050 emission reduction goals. We're looking to support and improve the technology readiness and commercial readiness of renewable energy technologies, energy efficiency, and electrification technologies. They're the 3 areas that ARENA's Act enables us to support. And we're looking for a significant reduction in Scope 1 and/or Scope 2 and/or improvement in efficiency in industrial processes. So we're not talking about incremental edge type activities, but we're looking to understand how a facility, how an organisation is pursuing deep decarbonisation goals, and what the particular project that you might want to bring to ARENA for potential funding, how that project would support that kind of reduction. As Tanya said earlier, we're looking to encourage technology demonstration and collaboration, and also knowledge sharing across industries and all regions, and importantly supporting the upskilling of the existing industrial workforce into new decarbonisation activities. Next slide, thanks, Tanya. So as I mentioned earlier, round 1, $150 million allocated, that has now closed, and round 2 is opening, or has opened, with a $70 million allocation to it. And we've formed that up into 2 streams. Firstly, for projects that are demonstrating innovation in industrial decarbonisation, and I'll go through that in a sec. And then secondly, those that are demonstrating advancing commercial deployment. And I'll just take a moment to explain what both of those mean. So I guess when we see projects coming to us, our experience has been that they sort of fall into these 2 buckets fairly naturally. The first is those technologies, those projects that perhaps haven't been done before, that they are really a new innovative way of processing or developing or providing the energy into a particular industrial process. And we recognise that doing things of a first of a kind is is difficult, it can be risky, it can be intimidating, and so that's where the ARENA funding can come into play to help offset some of that first once of a kind type cost or additional risk mitigation, that kind of activity. So we've provided a couple of examples there about what that might look like: new industrial processing routes or equipment, new electrification, a replacement of fossil fuels as either heat or reductant, and so on. And advanced thermal energy storage potentially fits in that space as well. The second bucket is probably the more common group, I think, in this space, which is where the technology being suggested for deployment is not necessarily brand new, it's not first of a kind, it's been done before, it might be commercially available technology, but it's not something that's commonly done, either in your particular industry or process or what have you. Why is that? There might well be financial or non-financial barriers that are inhibiting the uptake of that technology. So we're interested in understanding what those technologies are, what those barriers are that's stopping it being deployed today, and what role ARENA's funding might be able to contribute to helping to remove some of those barriers. So heat pumps is a classic example. Everybody knows heat pumps are out there, they exist. You can go and buy one, not necessarily at the temperature that you want. So that might be an innovative type technology that fits in bucket one. But for the lower temperature type stuff, they certainly exist, but they're not commonly used. So we're interested in understanding how ARENA funding could help accelerate the uptake of technologies like that. And there are other examples of similar sorts of technologies, MVRs, electric boilers, and so on. Deployment of electrified equipment or vehicle solutions in new use cases or at an unproven scale is another example. Again, commercially available equipment, but not being deployed at scale. So they'd be areas we'd be interested in looking at as well. And not to be forgotten, alternative financing or capital-light business models such as heat as a service, also an example of helping to deploy at scale commercial technologies to help decarbonise industry more rapidly. So that's what this round is about, 150 million, as I said. We're looking to provide a minimum of $500,000 funding with at least matched contribution, which implies a minimum project scale of $1 million cost. And just to make clear, those of you who've dealt with ARENA before will know this, but for the benefit of others, match funding does not mean it's an automatic match funding. We look at every project on its merits and look to understand what is the least amount of funding that is required to make this project make sense for your business. And we will provide that subject to the merit of the project. We would provide that amount up to a maximum of 50% of the total project cost. But in many cases, it may well be less than that. Next slide. Thanks, Tanya. So just very briefly, a few case studies just to give you a bit of a flavour of some of the things that have been announced or in the works. So the first one there is a study, in fact, for South 32 looking at steam electrification of their Wolseley alumina refinery. $4.3 million out of a total $8.7 million, looking to evaluate a couple of different technologies, being both electric boilers and mechanical vapour recompression, and trying to understand the sort of scale and the way to integrate those different technologies into the plant. And then coming out of the back of that study, it's intended a single scenario or option would be selected to then implement. Secondly, Fortescue looking to do fast chargers for heavy battery electric vehicles, 10 million out of 53. So you can see there's an example where it's not a 50-50. They're looking to implement a first of a kind 6 megawatt charger capable of charging the big Tonka toys that they drive around on mine sites in under 30 minutes. So that's quite a revolutionary type activity. And then finally, we're looking for calls for proposals around energy solutions for regional NGR decarbonisation, both in terms of electrification, energy efficiency, and long duration and storage and thermal storage. Thanks, Tanya.
Okay, perfect. I'd also, by the way, advise everyone to use your phone to scan the QR codes on the pages, because it links back to the relevant materials for those specific sections that we're talking through. And I might also take this moment to just acknowledge a typo on the previous slide where the Fortescue project is actually 35 mil and not 53. And I'll fix that in the materials before it goes out. So we now want to get into how ARENA actually considers eligibility and merit of a project, and then what the typical assessment and approval process actually is. So let's start with eligibility. So there's a couple of buckets that you have to hit in order to be eligible to apply for this program of funds. That doesn't mean necessarily that your project will be high merit and actually get funds, but you have to be eligible in the first place. So all of the detailed requirements on each of these are laid out in the program guidelines. So if you navigate to the program web page, you can search ARENA Industrial Transformation. This will all come up, but I had a couple of headline items that I wanted to call out. So first up, on eligible applicant, essentially, to be a recipient of ARENA funds, you have to be an Australian business. You have to have an Australian ABN. And I know there was a question in the chat on whether universities are eligible to receive funds. Under this program, they're not. So you can be a research organisation as long as you meet the other eligibility criteria, but universities in their own right as a funding recipient are not eligible under the ITS program. It doesn't mean that we can't work with consortiums which involve, say, overseas players or other OEMs, but that works best, as I say, when there is a consortium. So it might be the industrial player working with an OEM to jointly deliver a project. Which brings us on to the next point, which is the project itself actually has to be eligible. So you would have seen in Pete's description that we kept referencing the type of technology or the type of solutions, i.e. it has to be linked to renewable energy. It has to be linked to electrification or energy efficiency. So that's like the core intent of ARENA. Everything that we do revolves around renewable energy efficiency, electrification technologies. So if your solution doesn't meet that criteria, it's out of the boundaries of what ARENA does. In this program specifically as well, a project has to be beyond core research. So from a technology readiness level, it means that it's not including TRL 1 to 3, but 4 through 8, 9 is kind of the realm of sweet spot that we play in. What's important on location is that this program is intended for regional industrial facilities. So regional has to meet that outside of greater capital city statistical areas point. If you look at the FAQs, which I'll link in a second, you'll be able to click a link and then see on a map if your address falls inside or outside that area. The definition does include Kwinana, even though that's within a greater capital city statistical area, and it's also intended for existing industrial activity. So if you're planning to build a new process plant facility, it means that this is not the program of funds that can apply. The other important call out on location is that as well as being existing, this is intended for industrial facilities that report under the Haenke program. So the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting program, and that includes safeguard facilities. So if you think of the umbrella tiering, you have Haenke reporting, which includes everyone who has emissions over a specific threshold. And again, all the specifics are outlined in the guidelines. And safeguard facilities are within that overall bucket, which means that safeguard facilities can apply for this program as well. If the industrial facility is not Haenke reporting, then it's not eligible for this program. And again, we have some flexibility to who is the actual recipient of funds. But if you're working with an OEM, as an example, what can work well is if the OEM and the industrial player work together in the consortium, and then you figure out who is most sensible to actually be the recipient of ARENA funds. And then finally, you have to meet the IP, workplace, gender equality, and modern slavery requirements. Particularly on intellectual property, you have to prove that you have access to the relevant IP in order to deliver the project. Okay, so as I said, just because you're eligible, it doesn't mean that you actually access funds at the end of the day. So ARENA's got a very standard structure to how we consider the merit of an ARENA project. And they're divided into these 5 buckets. This is standard across all of ARENA's programs, but for the purposes of today, we're obviously going to be speaking specifically to the ITS program. And what's probably also worth calling out at this point is that this is not a competitive program. So compared to other grant programs, you might be familiar with accessing the site, filling out your information, pressing submit, and then basically hoping and waiting to hear back. This is not how this program works. So we want to have a conversation with you, understand whether there's a fit for your project, and then we'll work with you to basically make sure that we are convinced as our team that this project will be successful in the ARENA process when it goes through ARENA's investment hurdles. So we would provide feedback against each of these with these criteria in mind in order to prepare and then ultimately submit your project to ARENA's advisory panel, which is the technical recommendation panel, and then ARENA's board, which is the decision making, ARENA's board or CEO, depending on the quantum of funds for the project. So if we go through this list, first up, the project has to actually contribute to the program objectives. So those were the objectives that Pete was talking through. For example, is it contributing to emissions reduction? That might not be specifically within the timeline of the project, but if you, for example, are trialing a tech that if you then roll out to, say, all of your numerous industrial facilities, could then have a significant impact at end state, that would be taken into account. Again, it has to advance the technical or commercial maturity of a renewable energy efficiency or electrification technology. And it has to contribute to the regional decarbonisation and skills development of industrial facilities. Next up, this is probably more simple to explain. You have to prove that you have the right capability and capacity to deliver the project. So that's not only do the people have the right experience, the right qualifications, the right technical expertise, but do you also have the right resources, equipment, space, etc., in order to be able to successfully deliver. We then get into the actual project design and methodology. So that's how good is your approach, or how robust, rigorous is your plan? Are the timelines sensible? Are there really clear work packages? Are there clear activities and deliverables? Are the interdependencies well managed? Do you have a good risk plan, etc.? Next up is the financial viability and co-funding. So this is getting into the essence of, does the budget stack up? And it might just be a budget if there's no kind of revenue streams in the project, or it might be a financial model. Do the paybacks make sense? If there's an IRR, does the IRR make sense? Is the ARENA quantum of funds sensibly defined? So Pete spoke about being match funding, at least match funding, but that shouldn't be the anchor point. We need to understand and believe that there's a reason for the ARENA grant ask to be X million or Y million, and we have to believe that there's value for money in ARENA funding this project. That often becomes a question of replicability as well, if I think about tying back to the program objectives. So if your project is progressing a solution or a technology that is limited to a very niche area, that will also be taken into account. So we need to understand how this might be deployed at your facility, at other facilities, across your relevant industrial sectors, in order to properly weigh the ultimate merit of the project. And that ties very closely into the final point, which is knowledge sharing. And this is how ARENA thinks about return on investment. So we're obviously a granting agency, so we don't take equity, and we're not expecting some kind of commercial return. But what we do look for is the value of the knowledge that the project generates. So it might be evidencing that a specific technology works. It might be evidencing that the commercial case can stack up for a sector, for a use case, etc. It might be sharing lessons learned. It might be sharing the best practice approach to delivery. It's all the information that others can benefit from our funding. So all of this information is captured in what we call a project plan, and you can think of this as your pitch document to ARENA. So if you're looking for funding, this is your collateral or your documentation that you use to convince ARENA that your project is high merit and should receive funds, essentially. And this is the document that we'll review, provide feedback on, and use throughout the ARENA process. So to that point, what is the actual ARENA process? So to measure, probably to give the best estimate of expectations for what this looks like, this is the typical two-stage application process and approval that an ARENA project might go through. This can vary depending on the quantum of funds. So for example, if you're progressing an engineering study, which is eligible under this program, that might be pre-feasibility, it might be detailed engineering design, that could, for example, just be a one-stage application. So it would go straight to full application instead of doing the two steps. There's also a difference in the approval body depending on the quantum of funds of the project. But the main message that we wanted to land here is that ARENA essentially has a monthly opportunity for our advisory panel to sit. And that advisory panel is the equivalent of, say, an investment committee. And that's what the EOI and the full application refers to. And so that's a formal online submission, and then it's a review at a monthly panel meeting. So the important call out here is that there is some preparation before you submit that online, because our team needs to interrogate the docs, provide you some feedback, and make sure your project has the best chance of success going into that forum. So this is a plea more than anything else to please not lob in applications online without talking to ARENA first. So essentially, your first point of call is to submit an inquiry, which is a super short form, and you can do that on the website. Maybe we'll pop the link in the chat so that you have it, and it will also be sent out after this webinar, which gives you the okay to submit your EOI. If you're successful at EOI, you go into your full application. If it's approved at full application, or recommended at full application rather, it will then go to ARENA's board or CEO for approval before we negotiate the contract. ARENA also doesn't make any market announcements until that contract is executed. So that's why you kind of typically see a lag in ARENA project announcements. That doesn't mean that those projects aren't being assessed, and it doesn't mean those funds aren't being committed. It just means that they aren't publicly announced until those contracts are executed. So that's kind of a note to watch the space over the next few months, because you'll probably see some more projects announced under this industrial program. Okay, so if we get a bit more practical, how do you actually start a conversation with ARENA at the right time, especially acknowledging that round 2 is pitched to close in mid-July? And by close, it's close to new applications. So that's the first expression of interest point in that flow diagram. So basically, the first thing you want to do is actually test ARENA funding appetite. So we want to make sure that your time is best utilized and our time is best utilized. So we want to be convinced that there's a really strong investment thesis before you progress a month-long journey. So again, scan the QR code. This will take you to the right spot. You'll see an option to submit an inquiry which says, tell us about your project. This is the short form. It gives our team some information in order to triage whether or not we think this has legs. And usually what we'll do is we'll have a quick call to discuss the setup, the scope, and to ask any questions before we get into prep mode of a broader, more detailed project plan. It's worth talking about the key dates to prepare for, because like I said, before you actually get to that formal online application and sit at an advisory panel, there's some lead time to doing that. So again, the QR code here takes you to the dates on the program webpage, but what I've got on the right, and this is probably a worthwhile snapshot to keep, and we'll share the pack after this webinar as well, is that the panel sits monthly. And that's the final row of this short table on the right-hand side. It's submitting the online application. So I've put the dates for 3 panel occasions for EOI submissions. The final date, the mid-July date, being the close of round 2. So on the first column, you can see that if you're going to a mid-May panel, or sorry, if you're going to what would be the June panel, you have to submit by mid-May, which means that you probably would have shared your first draft with ARENA by the 1st of May, and you would have already spoken to ARENA about that concept before that point, so that you'd been able to turn some feedback and structure your project sensibly. That means for this group online, if you haven't already started talking to ARENA, the next closest opportunity is for a July panel, which is the second column, which means that you need to submit online by mid-June. And again, if you work backwards, that means time is very much running short to talk to ARENA about your concept, because you'd basically need to be crafting and submitting your application in June. So that probably brings the next opportunity for most of this cohort to the August panel. And again, you can kind of quite quickly see how the time moves on. So to meet that mid-July close date, which is the end of round 2, you kind of need to be discussing your inquiry and your concept with ARENA now in May, which means that you should share your draft application in July. So this is definitely a plug to crack on and give us a shout if you haven't already spoken to ARENA or submitted an inquiry. Of course, there are also future panel dates, but that bucket of funds is intended to be available first come, first serve. So while we expect to release another tranche of funding in around 3, there might be a bit of a time lag, and obviously those who get their applications in earlier will be assessed earlier for the funds available. I wanted to then use this opportunity to do a quick Slido pulse check while we've got everybody online. So I'll encourage everyone to scan this QR code. I'll also pop this QR code in the chat itself in a second, but I'm going to stop sharing the screen. So if you can get out your phone and take a quick snapshot in order to navigate to the right web page, I'll maybe wait 30 more seconds to give you a chance to do that. And then I'm going to flip up my screen to share the results of the Slido. So let me stop sharing now. I will add it to the chat in 1 second too. And then I'll flip my screen up on the results. Okay, nice. So first question, if your organization had to halve its scope 1 emissions within the next 12 to 18 months, how difficult would this be? still moving a little bit, so we'll give it another minute before I open the next question. And definitely encouraged to see that this is possible, and acknowledge that almost nothing in the world of industrial decarb is fairly easy, so appreciate that. In the interest of time, I will go ahead and release the next question. Okay, so that should be live now, and I'll jump into the output. Okay, so this question looking at which statement best reflects the status of your organization's decarb journey. We'll give it one more minute. All right, nice. In the interest of time, we are, okay, definitely, I think, encouraging to see the number of folks working on engineering studies, which, by the way, also eligible and we're definitely open to. It's actually a model that ARENA, that works quite well in ARENA, where you basically bring the engineering study for the work that you're doing, plus the actual implementation. And you can progress that essentially as a two-stage application where you get conditional approval for the implementation stage, but you just come first with the study. All right, last question, probably the most relevant to this group. So I'll get that going. Are you planning to come and ask ARENA about funding under ITS round 2? So we'll give that a minute or two. We also won't be offended if it's a no. Okay, fantastic. So for those of you that are answering yes, I'll share a very short survey link after this webinar to the full group that's registered. In that survey will be the chance to just submit your inquiry to ARENA for the concept. So you'll get that straight after this. If I can encourage you to just take 5 minutes to fill that out, that will basically help us tee up those conversations to make sure we can progress concepts at the relevant timelines. Okay, fantastic. I am going to call it there so that we have some time for questions. So appreciate everyone jumping on their phones and getting on Slido. So thank you for that. We've got 15 minutes now to run through Q&A. And great to see some of the questions in the chat. I'll also just put my screen back up on a bit of a prompt slide in case you are lost for ideas. But maybe while I do that, Pete, if you want to start on any of the questions in the Q&A.
I think most of them have been answered already. We've been responding to them in both the Q&A and the chat. And I think we've covered all of the Q&A to date, and I think all of the chat as well. So maybe you want to go on to your questions that you've got on your sheet, Tanya.
Okay, Perfect. I can definitely do that. And if you feel that your question hasn't kind of been fully answered in the Q&A, feel free to maybe react to it or bump it up, and we can bring that back up the list and talk about it live. But the couple that are probably, I would say, come most frequently, and again, if you scan this QR code, it'll take you to the full list of FAQs, which is quite useful just in general. So number one, how do you know if your project is regional? So this is the Greater Capital City Statistical Area question. In the FAQs, you'll be able to click a link which says you can basically check. It'll take you to a mapped boundary area. You can put in your facility organization address and just check where you are. You know, if you're on a boundary line, we're not going to be as pedantic as you have to be X or Y across the boundary line. But the very practical stress test here is if your operating facility is in the middle of metropolitan Sydney, that is not regional and therefore not meeting these criteria.
Tanya?
Yeah, go for it.
So there's a couple more have popped up in the Q&A, so I can go to those if you like.
Yep, 100%.
So there's a question here from Jordan just asking, is anyone who's received funding under PRSTS not eligible under ITS? You're not eligible under ITS for the same project, so you can't get funded from both streams for the same project. But if you've received funding for a different project, then you're perfectly able to come and speak to ARENA about ITS funding for a different project. Then there's also another one from Brett about clarifying the eligibility criteria. If a new technology project has a transformative reduction in scope 1 or 2 emissions, but does not necessarily directly include renewable energy or electrification, can the project be considered? Two parts to that answer, I think. There's three elements that ARENA is able to fund. That's renewable energy, electrification, and energy efficiency. So if it's one of those three, that's needed. We have seen some projects come to us that have significant scope 1 reduction potential in particular, but it's scope 1 that's unrelated to energy use. So let's just say, for example, landfill emissions, just as an example. If you've got some project that's going to reduce landfill emissions, but it's got nothing to do with energy, that falls outside the scope of ARENA's remit. But if you're doing something that involves reducing emissions associated with energy, then renewable energy, electrification, energy efficiency all fit.
And maybe to that point, a question that we often get asked as well is how carbon capture and storage fits into the eligibility of ARENA's mandate. So the short answer is that if the focus is on carbon capture and storage, that is not something that ARENA can support. It's simply outside ARENA's mandate, and so it's outside our funding bounds. There's also a question about whether the grant needs to go to the Haenke facility or whether it can be to their supply chain. So it's a good question. The recipient doesn't have to be the Haenke reporting industrial facility. But if that is not the case, the project consortium, which has to be a consortium, so they can't kind of just be, let's say it's an equipment provider, you can't just intend to, at some point, sell your piece of equipment or aim to sell your technology or your piece of equipment to an Haenke reporting facility. You have to be able to evidence a really direct link to that Haenke reporting facility within the project consortium. So for example, they would need to be, say, a project partner, they'd need to be inputting on the project. If it's a pilot, it might be being deployed at that Haenke facility, and they would be a project partner. So while there's room to basically firm up that relationship through the ARENA assessment process, you don't necessarily need to have a signed and sealed contract before you come and talk to ARENA. We will definitely look to see a meaningful relationship with that Haenke reporting facility as a part of the project. Another good question on whether or not ITS can consider a greenfield project, so whether it's not existing. And this is a very important clarification. Essentially, the Powering the Regions Fund is positioned to support the decarb of existing industrial projects. So in isolation, we couldn't support, say, the setup of a greenfield facility. There is room to basically bundle the deployment. Say you're looking at deploying a technology solution like a heat pump. You could bundle the deployment of that solution at multiple industrial sites, but you couldn't bring a brand new industrial site to ARENA because it wouldn't be eligible under this program. Pete, I don't know if you have any additions on that point.
Yeah, no, sorry, I was reading another question, so I missed that one.
No, I think it's okay.
Okay. Yeah, I was just reading another couple of questions that have popped up here. In case I missed it, what's the distinct change from phase 1 closed to phase 2? For example, do qualifying electrification projects apply in phase 2? I think the answer is if you're already in the process, you'll know you're in the process, and we'll be carrying out anything that's already in consideration from phase 1 carries on. It's not like we've closed the gate on that, but any new applications coming in will be considered in phase 2. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah.
And then we have another one. Can funding co-fund student employment to assist the implementation of the project we have in mind, i.e. are salaries included? Secondly, as we're regional, would it cover living costs for such students as we're not near suitable universities in order to tap into the students locally? Couple of points there. I think one is, yes, salaries can be included, either as in kind for existing staff, or as sort of a cash contribution where new hires are required. This is referring specifically to student employment, and universities makes it sound to me like we're talking to a university who's contemplating something. I think the short answer is it would be best to come to us and tell us the entirety of what the project is. As Tanya mentioned, this is not a university focused program, but a project can certainly can leverage some university input. So we just kind of need to understand the whole project to fully understand or to properly be able to answer that question, I think.
And maybe a worthwhile clarification as well is, even though there is a regional skills development point in the program objectives, the purpose of this program is not to support, say, training. So training programs, funds, educational activities is not the purpose of this program. Rather, it's skills development as a result of, say, trial, deployment, demonstration of technologies to support industrial decarb.
Thanks, Tanya. There's a couple of questions from Dante, who has a couple of questions both talking about fuels. I think just seeking clarification around whether renewable fuels are included, and the answer to that is yes. So renewable energy, our definition of energy is not confined to electricity. Energy means energy, so whether it's fuel, gas, electricity, they're all forms of renewable energy. So all of those are relevant to consider.
Sorry, you go ahead, Pete.
Just going to read another question. Can one consortium partner apply separately with different consortiums? Yeah, absolutely. Yep, that's an easy one. Over to you.
There was a good question here on whether for projects that do meet all of the eligibility criteria, what are the most common reasons why they're not successful in the application process? And so I would say reading the detail behind each of those merit criteria will really help showcase what we're actually looking for to demonstrate a high merit project. But in this space, there are a couple of criteria that tend to pop up. So I'd say, for example, really considering the replicability of the solution. So ARENA has to think about the long-term value or the replicable value of the funds that we apply, because we can't support the decarb of every single industrial facility. We just simply don't have the funds or the resources to be able to do that. So we want to make sure that the projects we do fund have the biggest bang for the buck for the industry. So if it's unclear the value that funding your project might bring, say to your sector or to the broader industry, or to other players, that can be a limiting constraint. So that's one thing. The other thing is just kind of really proving that this is the right fit solution. So this isn't just a solution that was put on the table because a specific OEM or supplier came to you and pitched their solution. We want to know that this is the most sensible solution for the industrial use case. And we tend to see that quite often. There's not a lot of rationale or sort of evidence-based decision-making for implementing X solution. It just happens to be the one on hand. So that's another thing. And then I'd say the final thing that really tends to trip up projects in this particular sector is the pathway to commercialization. So that's something of an arena term, I would say, but what it really means is if we fund this project, does it help future projects stand up without funding support? So we need to believe that there is a point in time and a logic to why the particular solution or the particular tech that's in consideration will stand up at some point without subsidy. If there's no pathway to that end state, that basically limits how successfully that solution might be deployed in the broader market. And I think, Pete, maybe it's useful to hand to you because we see this a lot in the heat space. So maybe, and actually in the bioenergy space as well. So any comments that you want to add there?
Just to support what you've said, I think, yeah, essentially, we can't and, really have there is no sort of public value in supporting technologies that can't demonstrate that there is a believable pathway to commercial deployment in the future. So, the project might make perfect sense for you and your facility. It may well be the case that you've got a commercial gap. It doesn't stack up financially, but some ARENA money would get you over the line, and we could help you achieve your particular decarbonisation goals, for example. But ultimately, that technology is just not economic, and nobody else is going to pick that up because it's uneconomic. Then, as Tanya said, essentially that would mean we would have to support every example of that for that technology to have widespread uptake, and we can't do that. So we are looking for projects and technologies that demonstrate that, yes, in this instance, it needs some help from ARENA, but there is a believable story that says down the track, ARENA funding is not going to be required. So I think that's
yeah. And it's probably also worth considering. So even though ARENA is tech agnostic, we do need to believe that the technology choice is justified. And we also consider our investment from a portfolio perspective. So a really good example in this space is ARENA's funded a lot of bioenergy related projects. If you're bringing us a bioenergy related project, there needs to be incremental value to this portfolio that we've funded to date, because we aren't just looking at every single project in isolation because we have a bound amount of funds and resources. I know we've only got 3 minutes left. There was one final question about location, which I can quickly triage. So the question was, in terms of location eligibility, do we look at the actual activity or the company registration location? So that answer is, it's about where the project is deployed or where the emissions abatement would ultimately occur. So if you've got a head office in the middle of Sydney, but you've got your pilot site in a regional location, that's fine. I think we have probably covered everything. I'll flip to a final page, one more QR code just for luck. I will share this over email as well to the forum that has attended, but this has got that very short survey where you can submit your concept inquiry. So definitely appeal to you to do that if you do plan to come to Arena for a chat. And as Pete said, whilst this round of funds is closing mid-July, if you have your concept in discussion with Arena before that point, we can still consider your project for a panel that might be post-July because of that lead time in prep. But we do have to kind of draw a line and say, all right, we need to triage this bucket of projects, and then we'll release a third round of funding. Okay, we're pretty much bang on time. So thank you all for your attention and patience. Stayed on to the end, much appreciated. And I will get back to everybody with a mail and a recording after this. All right, thank you very much.